Commercial property owners have been among the hardest hit since the beginning of the pandemic. So suing a non-paying tenant is an important tool in a commercial property owner's toolkit. Across the board, New York courts have held that the COVID-19 pandemic and Governor Cuomo's shutdown orders from 2020 do not excuse a commercial tenant's obligation to pay rent. Early on, a lot of tenants argued frustration of purpose or impossibility, claiming that it was impossible for them to pay rent while their business was shut, or that the purpose of their lease was frustrated when they couldn't go into their space or have customers in there. But courts have rejected these arguments, and earlier this year, in 2 cases, the First Department held that frustration of purpose and impossibility are not defenses to non-payment of rent based on the pandemic. Early on, there were a few cases in New York that held that a clause in a lease entitling a tenant to a rent abatement because of a casualty applied in the COVID-19 context. But earlier this year, the First Department held that the COVID-19 pandemic is not a casualty, and thus, these types of clauses do not allow a commercial tenant to withhold rent. Early on, a lot of commercial tenants were focused on whether a force majeure clause in their lease excused them from their obligation to pay rent. But under New York law, a force majeure clause is interpreted very narrowly, and it's only if the specific event that gives rise to the claimed force majeure is expressly listed in the clause does the force majeure clause apply. In many cases in which a property owner sues a non-paying tenant, the question is not whether the tenant is liable for the rent, but from whom the owner is going to be able to collect and how much. It's critical to scrutinize the guarantee, assuming there is one. There are generally 3 different types of guarantees that we see in the commercial leasing context. The first is an absolute unconditional guarantee, in which the guarantor guarantees all the tenant's obligations for the duration of the lease. The second is an absolute unconditional guarantee, in which the guarantor guarantees all the tenant's obligations under the lease, but only up to a set amount. The third is what's known as a good guy guarantee, which is when the guarantor guarantees all the tenant's obligations, but only up until the tenant surrenders possession back to the owner. People often ask me, what's the standard settlement that a commercial property owner will enter into with a non-paying tenant who owes past rent? The answer is that it totally depends on how much the tenant can be held liable for and whether and to what extent the owner is going to be able to collect, either from the tenant or the guarantor. Here at Schlamm, Stone & Dolan, we make these types of assessments almost every day, and we come up with a unique playbook that works for each specific property owner in each specific situation. So call us if you or a client have a non-paying commercial tenant from which you need to recover.